when Marjorie Grace uncovered a web of corruption involving two white officers and a crooked judge, she never expected her fight for justice to put her life in danger. Threatened and targeted, she made a move that no one saw coming. Exposing the truth would change everything. What she did next will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. Marjorie Grace was a 34-year-old black woman with short, curly hair that framed her face and an unwavering expression of determination. She sat at her small, cluttered office desk, the faint hum of a fan stirring the air around her. The room, filled with books on civil rights and legal files, felt like a fortress where she could focus on the work that meant everything to her. She was a human rights consultant, deeply committed to the fight against racial discrimination. Her work often put her at odds with powerful forces, and she was known for her outspokenness, especially when it came to issues of systemic racism. Her activism had earned her both admiration and enemies, but she had long learned to ignore the latter. Today, however, the weight of a discovery weighed heavily on her shoulders. A few days ago, while visiting a friend at the police station, Marjorie had overheard a shocking conversation between two white officers in the break room. They were discussing a bribe they had paid to a local judge. A bribe meant to ensure the conviction of a black woman for a crime she hadn't committed. The officers spoke casually, as if it were just another routine transaction. To them, justice was for sale, and the life of an innocent person meant nothing. The sound of their voices replayed in Marjorie's mind, and as the reality of the situation sank in, her resolve only hardened. This wasn't just a case of an innocent woman wrongfully accused. It was proof of a deep-rooted corruption within the very institutions meant to protect people like her. Marjorie knew that if she didn't act, the cycle of injustice would continue. She reached out to a trusted network of lawyers, gathering evidence in secret. But her quiet efforts didn't go unnoticed. The officers, unaware of her involvement, began following her, their intentions clear: intimidate her into silence. They didn't realize that Marjorie was never one to back down. Determined to expose the corruption that had stained the justice system, Marjorie felt the weight of the stakes growing heavier with each passing day. The officers' threats escalated, and soon it wasn't just her life at risk. It was her family's. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength, and her younger brother, who had always stood by her side through every struggle, were suddenly in the crosshairs. Marjorie's heart clenched with fear every time she thought of the danger they now faced. The officers weren't just trying to silence her. They were threatening the people she loved most. But Marjorie wasn't the type to back down. Fueled by the memories of her father's own battles for justice, she doubled down on her efforts. She had a team of trusted lawyer friends who helped her gather the evidence needed to bring the officers' corruption into the light. It wasn't easy. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered the insidious web that linked these officers to corrupt officials. And it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated case. This was a systemic problem, one that had existed for years, possibly decades. Despite the threats, Marjorie's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that the risk of exposing the truth was enormous, but the alternative, allowing the corruption to fester unchecked, was unthinkable. Every piece of evidence she uncovered made the truth more undeniable, but it also placed a larger target on her back. As the trial approached, she knew she had to be meticulous. She had recordings, testimony from witnesses, and financial records that tied the officers to bribes and misconduct. But just as she thought she had everything in place, a bombshell revelation rocked her to the core, one that would change everything she thought she knew about the case, and the very people she was fighting against. The day of the trial arrived, and Marjorie stepped into the courthouse, her heart pounding, but her head held high. The weight of what she was about to face pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. As she walked through the courtroom doors, the room seemed to hold its breath. The audience, the jury, even the court officials, all eyes were on her. Some looked at her with judgment, others with curiosity, but Marjorie could feel the undercurrent of hostility in the air. She knew she was up against a corrupt system, but she had no intention of backing down. Judge Harrison, the presiding judge, was already seated on the bench. A white man with a reputation for controversial rulings, his impartiality had always been questionable. But today, his actions would be put under the microscope. Marjorie's case, a direct challenge to the corruption surrounding him, was about to turn his world upside down. She could see his cold, calculating gaze from across the room, but it only steeled her resolve. The trial began, and the officers, those two men who had plotted to ruin the life of an innocent woman, took the stand. With smug confidence, they lied under oath, weaving a narrative of falsehoods, their eyes betraying no hint of remorse. They believed their plan was flawless, that their bribe to the judge would guarantee the conviction of the woman they had wronged. They were certain they had covered all their bases, and Marjorie, they thought, was just another powerless activist who would fold under pressure. But Marjorie had come prepared. During the cross-examination, she dropped the bombshell, a recording of the officers discussing the bribe, along with irrefutable financial records linking them directly to Judge Harrison. The room fell into stunned silence as the officers realized the trap had been set. But what they hadn't anticipated was that Marjorie had yet another ace up her sleeve, a revelation that would shake the entire courtroom to its core. As the trial neared its climax, Marjorie's final revelation shattered any remaining illusions about Judge Harrison's character. The courtroom gasped as she exposed the judge's true connection to her family. It turned out that Judge Harrison wasn't just another corrupt official in the system. He had once been a trusted associate of Marjorie's father, a towering figure in the civil rights movement. Her father had fought tirelessly for justice in that very courthouse, dedicating his life to dismantling the same systems of inequality that Judge Harrison now perpetuated. This was not just a betrayal of justice, it was a personal betrayal of everything Marjorie's father had stood for. The officers who had so confidently lied under oath began to panic as the weight of the exposure settled on them. They tried to backpedal, but it was too late. The damage was done. The media, which had been quietly following the case, now exploded with coverage. What had begun as a local scandal soon became a national story, sparking outrage and discussion across the country. Marjorie, once just another activist on the front lines of racial justice, had become the face of resistance against corruption in the justice system. The consequences were swift. The officers were fired from the force, their careers destroyed. Judge Harrison, whose betrayal cut so deeply, was disbarred, his reputation and future shattered beyond repair. Marjorie's courage had exposed not only individual wrongdoings, but the larger systemic racism that had poisoned law enforcement and the courts for generations. As Marjorie walked out of the courthouse, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time, the oppressive weight she had carried for so long lifted from her shoulders. The fight was far from over, but this victory felt like a turning point, one that honored her father's legacy and proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, truth and justice could prevail.